The banquet hall glowed with gold light, but the air was ice. My brother Cole tapped his glass, commanding the room. "To every Walker success," he declared, "the ones who make this family proud." Cheers rose. Then the pause. The smirk. Except Ethan. He's still chasing foolish dreams. Our family's shame. Laughter crashed around me, a chorus of knives. My mother grinned behind silk. My father stared past me as if I were air. I didn't move. My face calm, my silence deliberate. Because silence, when wielded right, can be the loudest scream. And in that moment I decided, 1 month later, their empire would crumble. Quietly. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt dismissed, betrayed, or made to feel invisible, or maybe you've experienced the deepest loneliness, or that unbearable pain of losing those you love most, share it. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, because maybe the next story will remind you of your own strength. The Walker estate stood like a monument on the Savannah River, its white columns glowing against a bruised sunset. To anyone driving past, it looked timeless, an emblem of Southern tradition. But to me, it felt more like a mausoleum, a place where warmth had been embalmed and replaced with pride polished to a cold shine. I carried a dish of peach cobbler I'd baked myself. Still warm, foil coverings steaming slightly in the evening air. I hadn't mentioned it in the family group text. Didn't need to. A peace offering only matters if someone wants peace. Inside, the smell of roast beef and cornbread hit me, mingled with faint lemon polish on the hardwood floors. Laughter spilled from the dining room. Familiar voices, but not mine. Not anymore. When I stepped into the room, I stopped. My usual chair, the one I'd sat in since I was 12, was gone. Not moved. Gone. In its place, a strange gap between seats, as if my absence had been carved into the table itself. My niece Lily, all of 12, glanced up from her phone, then whispered too loudly, "Uncle Ethan always tries too hard." Her mother hushed her with a sharp glare. Cole didn't miss a beat. He gestured casually toward a chair at the far end, past cousins and grandchildren, as if I were a distant relative they barely recalled. "You can take that one," he said, his tone flat, dismissive. I nodded, polite smile fixed in place, and walked to my new seat. Each step echoed against the tile like I was being marched farther from the family I once thought was mine. I sat, stayed quiet. But inside, I felt something colder than humiliation settle in my chest. Not grief. Not anger. Clarity. They hadn't just removed a chair. They'd made a statement, and they thought I wouldn't answer it. Dinner unfolded like a script I already knew by heart. Conversations swirled around me. New promotions, real estate deals, private school acceptances. My fork scraped lightly against the navy blue tablecloth, the one my mother had sewn years ago. I remembered choosing the thread with her when I was 10. Now it felt like it belonged in someone else's story. I tried once, briefly, to catch my father's eye. He looked right past me, gaze fixed on his wine glass as though I were furniture. Then came the moment Cole loved best, his performance. He rose with the easy swagger of a man who believed the room was his stage. He lifted his glass high, voice ringing out. The toast. To the real successes in this family. The ones who built something, who carried the Walker name forward. Not like Ethan, who's still chasing teenage dreams. Laughter detonated. It wasn't laughter that welcomed you in, it was laughter that pushed you out. My mother chuckled softly behind her napkin. My father smirked faintly, sipping his Merlot like he was watching a rerun he'd seen too many times. And then Cole added the dagger. He reached under the table, produced a small cardboard box, and slid it toward me with mock ceremony. Found this in Dad's garage. Figured you'd want your little trophy back. Inside lay a bent track medal from high school, dusty and forgotten. My only victory turned into tonight's prop. The table roared. Knives clinked against plates. Glasses rang like bells at a cruel wedding. I didn't move. My hand stayed perfectly still on the stem of my glass. My face gave them nothing. But inside, the silence burned hot, shaping itself into something sharper than words. If they thought humiliation was the end of my story, They hadn't seen what silence could do when it finally chose to speak. That night, back in Atlanta, the world felt small again. My apartment wasn't much. One bedroom, a second-hand couch, walls painted the color of faded cream. But it was mine. No chandeliers, no banquet tables, no laughter that cut like knives. Just the steady hum of the fridge and the soft weight of Rusty, my old hound, curled at my feet. I sat at the desk by the window, the lamp casting a warm pool of light over a single sheet of paper taped to the wall. My focus list. Every task crossed out in thick black ink, except one. Trust clause. I stared at those words like they were a locked door. The memory came uninvited. Last summer, the lawyer's office in Savannah. I'd stopped by to sign routine paperwork. And through a half-open door, I'd overheard Cole and my father. "Relax," my father had said with that dry chuckle. "Ethan never reads fine print. He's too emotional for contracts." Cole's laughter had followed, sharp, confident. "Exactly. He won't notice he's gone until it's too late." I remembered standing frozen in that hallway, heart pounding, hearing the weight of my eraser disguised as a private joke. Back at the desk, my hand brushed over the last uncrossed line on my list. My pulse steadied. I opened the drawer, pulled out a worn manila folder. Inside lay the documents I had collected months ago. Copies, amendments, emails. Evidence. I ran my fingers over the pages, not with anger but with precision. My face remained calm, even as my chest tightened. Silence had carried me this far. But silence with proof? That was a different kind of weapon. I leaned back in my chair, whispered into the stillness of the room. They erased me on paper. But paper can burn them back. Rusty lifted his head at the sound of my voice, eyes glinting in the lamplight. I scratched behind his ears and let out a slow breath. This wasn't about rage anymore. It was about clarity, about timing. And I knew the moment was coming. The rain came hard the next morning, rattling against my apartment windows in steady rhythm. I pulled the manila folder onto the desk and spread its contents like puzzle pieces waiting to be fit together. Each page smelled faintly of dust and old ink, the kind of scent that clings to records people hope no one ever reads. Bank statements, notarized amendments, email threads with subject lines so sterile they hid their venom. I traced the signatures, my father's sharp slant, Cole's rushed scribble, and then my own name, except it wasn't mine. The letters curved too perfectly, like someone had practiced forging me until I looked mechanical, lifeless. My stomach knotted. They hadn't just erased me. They'd used me. My identity was ink for their empire. I flipped to a document labeled Harbor Legacy Fund. Transfers moved in and out, routed through shell accounts, each one under the shadow of my name. My name, attached to debts, properties, and deals I'd never touched. I leaned back, pressing both hands flat against the desk. My reflection in the dark window stared back, pale and steady. They thought I'd never look, that I'd stay too wounded, too distracted to see the fine print. But now I saw it all. My pulse slowed, not raced. This wasn't fire anymore. This was ice, methodical and patient. I pulled a legal pad from the drawer and began writing, line by line, dates, amounts, forged signatures. Every receipt of betrayal cataloged with precision. No threats. No anger. Just facts sharp enough to cut. When I finished, I folded the first page, slipped it into a plain envelope, and wrote 2 words across the front. For Margaret. No signature. No commentary. Just the truth. I held the envelope a moment longer, feeling the weight of it. It didn't feel heavy. It felt like clarity made tangible. Then I whispered to myself, voice barely louder than the rain. The first strike won't be loud. It'll arrive folded, sealed, and impossible to ignore. By dusk, the storm had broken into a steady drizzle, the kind of rain that slicked every surface and turned streetlights into hazy halos. I drove south, the envelope tucked inside my coat pocket, its edges pressing against my chest like a second heartbeat. The Walker estate loomed as I pulled into the circular driveway. White columns gleamed under the wet glow of floodlights, and the manicured hedges glistened like they'd been polished for royalty. To me, it looked less like home and more like a stage set, grand, hollow and rehearsed. I stepped out of the car, shoes crunching against gravel dampened by rain. The air smelled faintly of pine and lemon polish. My hand slipped into my pocket, fingertips brushing over the envelope again. The brass mailbox stood beside the gate, polished, proud, engraved with the family crest. A crest that had never felt like mine. I pulled the envelope free, its paper softening slightly in the drizzle. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the dark windows of the house. I thought of my mother inside, Margaret, probably arranging flowers on the table, humming to herself, pretending everything was flawless. She had once blocked my number. And now, in a few hours, she'd open this envelope and find the truth no toast could cover. I slid it into the mailbox. No flourish. No hesitation. The flap closed with a dull thud, swallowed by brass and silence. I lingered only a second longer, whispering into the drizzle. You can't see a shadow until it moves. Then I turned, walked back to my car, and drove away. No glance in the rearview mirror. No second thoughts. As the estate shrank in the distance, my chest felt lighter, not with joy, but with certainty. The first strike had landed. Quiet, almost invisible. But silence has a way of echoing. And mine had just begun. 2 days later, I found myself in Nashville, rain still clinging to the edges of the week. I ducked into a coffee shop tucked between an antique bookstore and a pawn shop, one of those places where the air smelled like cinnamon and old paperbacks. The line inched forward, and that's when I noticed her. A young woman at the counter, apron tied loosely around her waist, eyes rimmed red. She wiped them quickly whenever she thought no one was looking, but tears don't obey orders. When it was my turn, I gave her a small nod. "Tough day?" I asked quietly. She let out a bitter laugh, the kind that comes from exhaustion. "Family," she muttered, punching in my order. "They said I wasn't one of them. After everything I gave, they still erased me." The words hit me like a mirror shattering. My chest tightened, not from surprise, but from recognition. Later, during her break, she sat at a table by the window, pulling off her apron like it weighed 100 pounds. I hesitated, then sat nearby with my coffee. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain tapped against the glass. Outside, a family walked by, parents, kids, all laughter and warmth, the kind that cuts deepest when you've been denied it. Finally, she looked over. "You ever feel invisible?" I held her gaze. More than once. She smiled faintly, though her eyes were still clouded. "You're not invisible. People like you never are. They just don't want to see you." Her name was Emily, and in that instant, something shifted. I wasn't just staring into her pain. I was staring into my own, reflected back with clarity. As she returned behind the counter, shoulders a little straighter, I thought, maybe silence doesn't have to walk alone. The package was waiting for me when I got home. No label, no return address, just my name scrolled across the front in sharp black ink. The cardboard felt oddly heavy in my hands, like it carried something more than weight. I carried it to the kitchen counter, tore the tape slowly. No rush. Fear and anger were luxuries I had long stopped giving them. Inside was an old photo album. Brown leather, cracked spine. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen it in years. Grandpa had given it to me on my 18th birthday. "This is yours," he'd said. I flipped it open. The first page showed my mother on a park bench, smiling, holding a stroller. My face, gone. Scratched out violently with a thick red marker. My hand stilled. Next page. Birthday candles. A Christmas tree. Soccer team photo. Each time, the same red blur slashing me from existence, leaving everyone else intact. By the time I reached the last page, my fingers trembled despite myself. There was no photo, just a torn scrap of paper taped to the leather. In Cole's handwriting, deliberate and sharp. Should have stayed gone. The kitchen light flickered overhead, buzzing faintly. Rusty shifted at my feet, sensing the change in the air. I closed the album slowly, set it down on the counter like it was radioactive. For a long moment, I stared at the leather cover, breathing steady. No rage. No tears. Just a clarity that cut colder than fury. They weren't just erasing me from memory. They were reminding me that to them, I'd never belonged at all. But I smiled then, thin, controlled. Because what they didn't know was that every act meant to erase me only sharpened my resolve. They wanted me invisible. Perfect. Shadows don't scream. They move. And when they move, no one sees them coming. 2 nights after the package, I drove across town to a quiet office building above a shuttered insurance agency. The sign on the door was blank, no receptionist, no nameplate, just a single knock before the door opened. Inside, the office smelled of old leather and stale coffee. The walls were lined with file cabinets, each drawer labeled in Dalton's careful handwriting. He looked older than I remembered, hair gone silver, shoulders stooped, but his eyes were still sharp. "Ethan," he said, voice low. I wondered how long it would take. I sat across from him, the album still heavy in my memory, though I hadn't brought it. "They used me," I said flatly. "My name. My signature." Dalton opened a drawer, slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents I hadn't seen, property deeds, trust amendments, loan transfers. My name scrolled across them in ink I'd never touched. "They forged you," Dalton confirmed, tapping the page with one finger. "And not just once. They built an entire shell fund on your shadow. Harbor legacy. On paper, you're liable for debts you don't even know exist." The words should have stung. Instead, they steadied me. Because they were proof. I traced the crooked signature, my name bent into something hollow. They thought I'd never see it. They thought my silence was ignorance. They were wrong. I began pulling out my phone, snapping photos of each page, each signature. Then I opened my laptop, scanning them one by one into a new folder labeled with a single word: receipts. Not revenge. Not rage. Record keeping. Dalton watched me, his gaze unreadable. "You plan to go public?" he asked. I shook my head. Not yet. Precision matters more than spectacle. For the first time that night, I felt calm. Not crushed, not erased, but anchored. I closed the folder, slid it back across the desk, and whispered, "Every lie has a receipt. And I'm done letting them keep the books." The annual Walker Heritage Brunch was meant to be flawless. Linen tablecloths starched stiff, silverware gleaming, name cards folded into neat triangles. The private banquet hall buzzed with chatter, champagne flutes raised beneath crystal light. Cole stood at the head of the table, my parents beside him like royalty. He wore that same confident grin, the kind that assumed the room was his to command. "Family is everything," Cole declared, knife tapping gently against his glass. "Loyalty is what keeps our name strong." Heads nodded. Laughter drifted. But when I stood, the air shifted. I slipped 3 envelopes from my coat pocket and laid them on the table. One before Cole. One before Richard. One before Margaret. Each sealed, notarized, deliberate. "What is this?" Margaret asked, her voice sweet, masking the tremor in her hand. "Weekend reading," I said calmly. "Property transfers. Loan consolidations. Offshore accounts. All under my name." Cole scoffed, tearing his envelope open. His smirk faltered. Richard's jaw tightened as he scanned the pages. Margaret's fingers trembled against the paper. The room quieted, the hum of conversation collapsing into a vacuum. Then I pulled out my phone. Pressed play. Cole's voice spilled into the silence, recorded months earlier. "We used Ethan's name for the trust paperwork. They'll never know. The guy's practically signing his own liability." The sound cut like glass across the room. Forks froze midair. Glasses returned to the table untouched. Everett tried to laugh it off, but his eyes betrayed him, darting, searching for an escape. I met their gaze one by one. "You erased me for your comfort. I'm restoring myself for my sanity." The table was stone still, the weight of truth heavier than any toast. I slid one final sheet of paper onto the table, a formal legal complaint. Identity theft. Breach of trust. Conspiracy to defraud. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to, because the silence in that room screamed louder than anything I could have said. The banquet ended in fractured silence. No applause, no closing toast, just the clatter of silverware abandoned mid-meal and whispers darting like shadows. I walked out first, pushing through the double doors into the cool night air. The parking lot stretched wide under floodlights, asphalt slick from a recent drizzle. My car waited near the far end, headlights catching faint glimmers off puddles. Behind me, hurried footsteps. Uneven. Ethan. Cole's voice, sharp and ragged. I didn't turn. My keys were already in my hand. Measured. Then a hand clamped down on my shoulder, yanking me back hard against the side of my car. The impact jolted through my ribs. Cole's face hovered inches from mine, twisted with rage, eyes bloodshot with humiliation. "You think this is over?" he hissed, breath hot with whiskey. "You ruined everything." His fist tightened on my collar. For a moment, the floodlight above us flickered, throwing his shadow large across the asphalt, like a predator exposed. I didn't fight. Didn't flinch. I met his eyes with steady calm. "No, Cole," I said quietly. "You did this to yourself." From the corner of my vision, I caught movement. The valet, barely 20, frozen mid-step, a set of car keys dangling from his hand. His eyes locked on Cole's grip. A second later, he pulled out his phone. The screen glowed blue, recording. Cole noticed too late. His grip faltered, rage twisting into panic. He shoved me once more, then staggered back, adjusting his cuffs like nothing had happened. "You think they'll believe you over me?" he spat, voice cracking. I glanced toward the valet, phone still pointed like a spotlight. "Maybe not me," I answered evenly. "But they'll believe the footage." Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Minutes later, 2 officers arrived. Questions were asked. The valet handed over his phone without hesitation. Cole tried to mask his fury with indifference, but the crack in his armor was clear. And when the officer finally led him toward the cruiser, his eyes met mine. Not mocking this time. Not triumphant. For the first time, Cole looked afraid. I stood there in the floodlights' glow, heart calm, silence heavy as judgment. By Monday morning, the machine had already moved. Headlines bloomed across small online outlets like weeds. Sources claim Ethan Walker has history of emotional instability. The words were vague, slippery. No names, no facts, just shadows crafted to stain. I read them in silence, coffee cooling on the counter. It was classic Cole. Fight evidence with rumor, replace truth with whispers. My phone buzzed with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. PR damage control, lawyers, family friends. I let them ring. Then came the knock at my door. Mr. Landers, my grandfather's old estate lawyer, stood there in his weathered trench coat, holding a brown envelope. His eyes were tired but resolute. "It's time," he said simply. Inside the envelope was a single page, crisp, bearing my grandfather's unmistakable signature. I had read it before, but seeing it now felt like the ground shifting. If any member of this family, directly or indirectly, attempts to defame or discredit Ethan Walker's name, through media, legal maneuvering, or private channels, the remainder of my estate shall be transferred to the Children's Medical Relief Fund, under Ethan Walker's name. I ran my thumb over the ink, steadying my breath. They hadn't just lost the moral high ground. They had triggered the claws that turned their empire into dust. Landers folded the page neatly, slid it back into the envelope. "I'll send the notice to the trust lawyer this afternoon," he said. I nodded once. Quietly. He met my eyes. Of course. When the door closed, I sat in the quiet, the weight of generations humming through the room. Outside, the rain had lifted, but the sky still wore a gray film, like the world itself was holding its breath. They had tried to smear me, tried to erase me with ink and whispers, but my grandfather had already written the final word. And it wasn't silence. It was justice. The Walker estate no longer gleamed. When I pulled into the long circular drive at sunrise, the iron gates sagged on their hinges, rust biting through the family crest that once shone like gold. A moving truck sat on the lawn, its hazard lights blinking, 2 men hauling out furniture wrapped in plastic. The house itself looked skeletal. Curtains gone, windows bare, columns streaked with water stains. It didn't feel like a home anymore, just a hollow stage where pride had played its last scene. I stepped through the front door. The air was colder than outside, heavy with the scent of dust and old lemon polish clinging to walls stripped of pictures. Each step echoed as I moved down the hallway, past the study where my father once taught me chess, past the staircase Cole used to run down with arms spread like he owned the world. And then, by the fireplace, I saw it, a broken frame lying face down on the floor. I bent down, glass crunching under my fingers as I lifted it. The photo inside was from a family reunion, everyone smiling in neat rows. Richard, Margaret, Cole, cousins, uncles. My corner had been cut out with scissors. Precise. Erased. For a long time I just stared at it, my reflection fractured across the broken glass. Then I leaned it gently back against the hearth, not out of sentiment, but closure. They could cut me from the picture. They could carve me out of the frame. But they could never undo the truth now. Walking back out through the front door, the gravel crunched louder than I remembered, like the house itself was groaning under the weight of its silence. I paused at the crooked mailbox, its brass crest dulled and cracked. For a moment, I thought about slipping one more page inside, some final word. Instead, I just laid a hand against the cold metal. "I'm done carrying this," I whispered. Then I turned, stepped into the morning light, and didn't look back. Weeks later, my world was smaller again, but not empty. The office was nothing fancy. Second floor above a hardware store, walls painted off-white, humming radiator in the corner. Yet on the glass door outside, new letters gleamed in fresh black paint. Walker Campus Foundation. Inside, 2 young hires worked late, sorting through files. Both had been dismissed before, called dead weight, too soft, by the same circles that once mocked me. Tonight, their laughter floated through the room as they traded stories, no longer invisible. I stayed behind after they left. The room grew quiet, only the tick of a clock and the soft rattle of rain against the window. On my desk sat the last document to file away. Above it, taped to the wall, a mission statement in my own handwriting. No one should have to scream to be heard. I leaned back, letting the words settle. For years, I had carried silence like a curse. Tonight it felt like a compass. Rusty stirred at my feet, tail thumping once against the floor. I reached into the drawer, pulled out an old bronze compass, my grandfather's. Its needle wobbled as always, tilting, resisting, then slowly settling north. I placed it gently on the shelf beside the mission statement. For the first time, it didn't feel like a relic. It felt like direction. I turned to the camera, the invisible witness that had followed me through erasure, humiliation, and reckoning. "If you've ever been erased," I said softly, steady gaze unblinking, "know this: silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. And your truth matters. Don't waste energy screaming for people who refuse to listen. Build something they can't erase." The words hung in the air, not loud, but undeniable. I clicked off the lamp, the office sinking into quiet. Not emptiness, earned quiet. No bridges burned. No wars waged. I just stopped letting them walk across me. They lost money. They lost their grip. And I built something that finally felt like mine.